Welcome back to Sika Strength and welcome back to Sika Stan. I'm Owen, this is Dara. We are weightlifting coaches. We have coached thousands of athletes across different sports over probably a combined 20 plus years at this stage. We want to help you address some of your problems and get your progress faster than you would have otherwise and not make those mistakes. And one of the most common programming mistakes we see when people are weightlifting is you've messed up your training block. You've gone too heavy. Maybe you did too much volume and too heavy. Maybe you started your squats too heavy. Something's gone wrong. You were supposed to be doing a 12-week peak for this competition or this peaking at the end, and you and your friends in the club are all going to peak in 12 weeks. You're on week 4 and suddenly things don't seem right. It's week 5, things don't seem right. We're trying to see what mitigation you can do. We're going to give you some recommendations on how to address that. And first up is, how do you know you've effed it up? How have you beeped it up?
There's a song, How You Know You Effed Up, isn't there?
There is.
Maybe we'll strum that along. So the first thing, with how to know when you've gone too heavy, weightlifting is a really good sport because we have some very, very sensitive kind of trackers as we go throughout. And the first thing we have here is snatch and clean and jerk technique. So in a somewhat unique thing to the sport of weightlifting, as you have already gone too heavy, you can still keep progressing. You might have gone too heavy for the last 2 or 3 weeks, and you'll still keep making the progress, but your technical prowess will be absolutely in the toilet. So what does this look like? This looks like bending your arms early in the pull. This looks like not getting your knees back out of the way and having the barbell looping out around. This might look like jumping back a lot in the catch of the snatch or the clean. All of these major technical errors will start occurring, and they're occurring because you just don't have the ability to lift those weights yet. So although the perfect technique is the best way to lift a weight, if you haven't quite physically developed to be able to lift with that perfect technique, you can still start horsing those weights up or bulldogging your way through those weights, but you're not quite ready to get there. So first thing, great thing, really sensitive marker. If we start getting technical breakdown in the snatch, the clean, or the jerk, it's an immediate red flag. Something has gone wrong here. Now, the second thing is much more of a common marker of going a bit too heavy too early, and that's physiological stress. So that might be DOMs lasting longer than normal. Maybe it's with your squats, and usually the day after or 2 days after you have some leg soreness or some back soreness. Now we start seeing that being prolonged, and it goes to 72 hours or 4 days worth of DOMs. In any of those cases, we've already fatigued ourselves too much, and it's probably because we've gone too heavy or we've hit that volume a bit too hard. Now, the great thing about the physiological symptoms is that we have immediate feedback. This differs from the technical symptoms in the fact that we might start developing bad habits that last a long time or that will stay with us throughout the entire block. Whereas with the physical symptoms of that overtraining or going a bit too heavy, a bit too early, the physical symptoms will dissipate quite quickly once we start to make those physical changes, and then that shouldn't follow us through for the rest of the block. Now, the third aspect of knowing you've gone a bit too heavy, a bit too early in the block, is when we start seeing large amounts of irritability or that psychological stress around training. So if you're building up momentum nicely as you go throughout a training block, you'll be excited for each of the training sessions. It's not necessarily that they'll be easy training sessions, absolutely not. Weightlifting is a difficult sport. Training for weightlifting is a difficult thing to do, and it requires a lot of grit just to get through the blocks. But you should have that psychological momentum to be going into training sessions, to be hitting those sessions hard, not necessarily being excited and gleeful about every single session in every single week, but you should have that kind of prowess behind you. If you're finding you're really kind of holding yourself back from going training, maybe you get home in the evening and you don't necessarily want to hop in the car or go out to the shed and lift the weights, then that is a kind of yellow flag. Maybe we're pushing ourselves a bit too early. Maybe there's something I need to change here.
So you've decided that you've fucked up the block. You decided that something's gone wrong and it needs to finish, or you need to do something different than just where you're at. The first step a lot of times is actually to finish out the block. Now that might be finishing it very, very soon. Maybe you're on week 6. Sometimes it's time to finish next week. So you don't have to just stop the training block here. There's some value to actually continuing to a max out session and seeing what numbers you end up hitting. So if you're, say, 12-week block, maybe a 16-week block, and you've durations in volume and intensity planned out, and you're week 6 now, and it should be more triples next week, and you've been doing triples for the last 2 weeks, what you should probably do is just do a little bit of heavier singles this week, and then next week go for a max single or a heavy single. Now, that might sound counterintuitive, it might sound kind of silly, but there's a couple of benefits to that. First of all, it gives us just honest representation of where we're at, where we're lifting. It gives us benefit of objective, what is happening with my weightlifting? Where is my weightlifting at right now? What did the previous few weeks or previous few months, depending on where you're at, what did it do for my weightlifting? Did it change it? Not at all. Is it worse right now? Is it better? There's a lot of benefits just to seeing what happened. And you have this data, you know you've done something wrong. So it's good to see what did that data do wrong for you. Or maybe it might realize itself in a different manifesting in those heavier attempts. So there's this objective data collection benefit to going for those heavy singles. You don't have to go in and go balls out. You can be very, very strict. You can be super cautious. You can be like, hey, absolutely no misses. If I hit my first miss, I'm done. No more snatching. If I miss my first clean and jerk, done, no more snatching. You can go, I'm only going to go for weights that I can definitely hit today if I'm feeling good. And that's all very valuable and smart, and we don't want to be going and missing 15 times, but it is valuable to finish out that block and put a flag at the end of that training session or that training block and say, okay, this is where we finished, and to reset, because that is valuable. There's also a lot of value in the psychological benefit of going heavy when you were supposed to go heavy. Very frequently, and we see this mostly in weightlifting, and we haven't really seen this in other sports, where 400-meter runners going for the PB 400, and if they're not feeling great, they'll still go for it. Maybe they've had a bad night's sleep from nerves or from their kids or something completely unrelated. They'll still go for that 400. Powerlifters will still go for their maxes. But there's something about weightlifting where it's a little bit intimidating, and very frequently we'll have lifters pull out of a competition because they're a little bit afraid of it. And this isn't me judging them. I'm not saying that you have to go full David Goggins with things. It's your life. You do what you want. But there is a lot of benefit to going for these heavy maxes or doing these competitions even when things don't go well. There's a lot of benefit just to show up, do your best, even when you know it's not going to go well. Because when you do show up in the future and you are at your best, you're going to be even more resilient. You're going to be even stronger psychologically for these weights. But if you bitch out of weights when you were supposed to go heavy, you're admitting defeat early. You haven't even attempted what's going on. And there's a lot of benefit, unless you're in a lot of pain, unless you've injured yourself, then of course stop and reset from there. But we're talking about programming errors here, not injury errors. So if it's just a programming issue, follow through. Put your best foot forward, accept that you've done something wrong. You know, you're going to make mistakes in your training, or maybe your coach has made mistakes, but it's still good to psychologically show up and know that you can hit some heavier weights. And if you're hitting 90% plus, you should be like, right, this is good. Nothing terrible happened. I didn't hurt myself, and I can still hit these weights even when things haven't been going great. So there's a lot of benefits to that psychologically and physically. So heavier weights in the snatch and clean and jerk have their own benefit, and it is useful just to attempt these weights. You know, there's no real limit to how much you can max your snatch, clean and jerk. It won't be very beneficial. It won't be very productive in weightlifting, but at correct intervals, and realistically, if you're cutting your block early and you're going to be starting a new block, it's going to be a while before you go for heavy snatches and clean and jerks again. So there's literally physical benefits to your weightlifting just to show up and do this, where you record the cues you're focusing on. You can see how it's feeling. Did your back suddenly start rounding at 90% plus when you didn't have that issue? Did your shoulders move forward off the floor? Did they hunch up? Did your arms start bending above the knee in the clean at 90% plus when you didn't have that issue? So you're getting some benefits from them. Again, more objective data to bring forward with you once you finish this block. So cut it early. If it's week 10 of 12, just continue to week 12 unless things are terrible. If it's week 4, finish on week 5 or 6. It's 2 weeks of training. In the long run, it's a very small part of that grand scheme, and it is useful just to physically and psychologically just cut the pizza there, finish it, start the new slice next week.
Give them the chop.
Give them the chop.
The next thing then is, how do you actually change the program? So we've identified that we've overtrained, or we've pushed ourselves too heavy too early. Secondly, then we figured out, okay, I actually can finish out the block. It's 4 weeks into a 16-week cycle. There's just simply no way of me finishing this. How do we change it? So let's just take the framework of like frequency, intensity, time, and type, which you'll commonly see in exercise science papers. So let's look at frequency firstly. As a weightlifter, Do we necessarily want to change the frequency of our training? Probably not, right? It's unlikely that that's the best move possible for us. Why so? Well, the first thing is the frequency relates directly to how often you get to touch the barbell for snatch and clean and jerk. Now, in a highly skill-dependent sport, where realistically we're always developing better technique, cutting the frequency is probably not the first thing we should do. So this gives us less time in contact with the barbell, less reps, less time even just warming up with the barbell and moving the bar around. It's all about just accumulating those quality reps, so it's probably not the first thing we're going to change. Intensity then. Is intensity a good thing to change? Yes, absolutely. Intensity is probably the main thing you messed up when it came to writing your training block. We're literally talking about going too heavy too early in the cycle. Intensity, mainly in the sport of weightlifting, is the weight we have on the bar. So intensity is how relatively difficult that exercise is to complete. The big monitor or the big marker of intensity in the strength sports is the weight of the barbell. Now, obviously, we have other things like the relative difficulty of that variation or that complex or that derivative of the lift. That's not necessarily the first thing I would change. The very first thing we would go to is what weight is on the barbell, and let's pull that weight back. What does that look like? Well, in most of our training algorithms in the last kind of 2.5 years, we've gotten all of these down on paper, really started logging out how we train people and how we change their training programs from week to week. Most of the time, a kind of grade 1 style error, a minor error, doesn't negotiate any change or doesn't necessitate any change in intensity. A grade 2 error is what we would consider to be something where we need to bring that intensity down, and most of the time that looks like a 10% decrease in their intensity. So a 10% decrease in loading for next week. Now, 10% block or 10% stepwise deload across the entire block tends to be the best thing. If you're very close to the end of a training cycle, what you might try and do, or if we have a very defined goal for the end of it, is we might take 10% off this week, 7.5% off this week, 5% in this week, and then let's hope that by week 4 we're already back, or we're back on track with our standard progressions. That isn't a tactic that I would recommend for most people. That is a very specific competition tactic where we know we need to hit this certain lift at this certain week. For most people, a 10% stepwise decrease across the entire block will work absolutely perfectly. So then moving on to time. The actual time we have with the barbell, a better variable to look at here is volume. So the amount of reps multiplied by the amount of sets. And if we want to look at over the course of the week, multiplied by the amount of sessions you're doing snatches or cleans or jerks for. To be honest, volume isn't something we immediately go to. This is kind of the second thing we would change here. And this will be a very just small pullback in terms of volume. So maybe we were going for 8 sets of doubles on the snatch in a particularly high volume week. Let's maybe just pull that back to 7 or 6 sets. What we can also look at when we look at total volume is maybe in some of our longer complexes. So maybe we had clean plus front squat plus push press plus jerk. Maybe we just pull that back a tiny amount. Maybe we take those push presses out of there, or maybe we pull back some of the reps on the jerk at the end of the complex. These are small little tweaks we can use going from week to week to ensure the athlete is kept on track. But as I said earlier, this isn't the first place we go to. Finally then is type. So type in many cases would talk about whether it's cardiovascular training or strength training or speed training. In this case, let's just look at the actual exercises we're doing, and across almost every program, we are not going to change exercise selection because we went a bit too heavy too early. Now, where this may occur is with some of the accessory lifts, where maybe we were doing a handstand hold against the wall, and the initial phase of those progressions is a 10-second hold with some help. That's about the only time we change it, where if they can't even achieve 10 seconds against the wall, then they go to a pike hold or something along those lines. Or maybe we are doing a very, very simple set of push-ups and the person can't achieve those sets and reps, then they'd go to a scaled push-up. But for most of the actual lifts, for snatches, for cleans, for jerks, for their derivatives and their variations, we're not going to change the type of exercise we're doing.
Now, lastly, we need to decide, is there times for a hard reset where we immediately have to stop? And then we need to know, when do we reset or restart or start a new training block? So there's a few cases where we don't need to go for that max, or we shouldn't go for that finishing the block, whether it's finishing prematurely or finishing when we were supposed to finish. And the main one is when you are injured. So if there's physical manifestations of an injury, maybe it's an acute injury, you pulled your hamstring or you hurt your quad or your shoulder is super sore. We're talking 6 to 7 to 8 out of 10 on the pain scale. It's crossed the threshold where we're comfortable training with. It's crossed the threshold where we are being smart at training and we're just being a bit of a silly billy. There's other words I want to use, but the algorithm doesn't like those. So your injury, whether it was a joint injury, whether it's a tendon issue, has gotten just too sore. You've gone and saw someone, or you don't even need to go see someone because you know right now that it's already too sore. That's one of the times where we really need to just consider what's going on. Are you going to the Olympics in 10 weeks? If no, then it probably is prudent just to go, okay, we need to reset here. We need to stop for a minute, assess what's going on. Training's only going to make this worse. You're so sore that you're probably not even going to hit good maxes, so nothing productive is going to come from going along. And very common injuries in weightlifting are repetitive strain injuries, and these are the ones that are often made worse by continuing to train with weightlifting. And so this is one of those cases where you probably need to just stop. The other one then is when we're probably hit something that's still an injury, but it is more manifestation of maybe acute overtraining or actual long-term overtraining. If someone tells you overtraining is not real, then they are frankly an idiot. There's clear clinical symptoms. The mechanism by which overtraining happens and why they manifest with these symptoms isn't exactly clear right now, but overtraining is very distinctly real. It's well documented in the research. There's no argument among the research about whether overtraining is real. Only Instagram fitness influencers tell you it's not real and tell you to carry the boats. But researchers, there's clinicians, there's symptoms like erratic heart rate, really low heart rate, really high blood pressure, low blood pressure, poor quality sleep, insomnia, irritability, a whole host of different manifestations, high blood inflammation markers, stuff like C-reactive protein, your immune system markers in your blood might be very, very high. There's a lot of different things in the ways it can manifest itself, and usually it's a combination of a couple of different ones of these. And that's one of those cases where, although rare, although quite hard to get to, can very definitely happen. And in weightlifting, it does happen to lifters when they keep pushing themselves. Sometimes it happens when you've done 3-4 big competitions and then you're going for your 5th one that year. Maybe you've had to qualify for things, you had to qualify for nationals, and then you did the big international competition, and then suddenly you have to roll around for next year's qualifiers, and then before you know it, you have diarrhea and you can't sleep at night and your blood pressure is all over the place, and that's when you manifest. So that's one of the cases where we just need to stop. So the only times we need a hard reset is when there's something clearly wrong with us and it's injury or pain or overtraining. But when these aren't present, that's when we kind of keep going for that step 2 where you just go ahead and hit some singles. Now, how long do you wait before you start the next training block? Assuming it's not a rehab protocol, which has its own defined length of time, or depending on what therapist you go see, you follow that protocol. But if it's just a programming area where you've just messed up, generally be a little bit more cautious than you think you need to be. You probably can get straight back on the horse. You probably can start next week and reduce the loading and drop 30-40%, go back to 60-70% and hit your volume again. But you're almost certainly better off being prudent for a week or two. If you've gotten so far that you've messed up something really wrong with programming, it means you've hit a certain type of fatigue, or it likely means you've hit a certain type of fatigue that needs some time to dissipate. So you're going to lose nothing by just spending 1 to 2 weeks. I would like to say 2 weeks as kind of the benchmark to recommend, where you go to the gym twice a week, maybe 3 times a week, and you just do a little bit of snatching, a little bit of clean and jerking, and a little bit of squatting, and you let that fatigue dissipate. You relax about training. You build up that psychological hunger for training where you're ready to go for those sessions again, and then you hit the ground running with a clear plan. Maybe you got on the Sikastrength app, or you talked to your coach and you've reevaluated what you're going to do. Or you've created a new program for yourself that you're confident is better than the last one. But give it time. 2 weeks will not make any difference in your career. The average age of a weightlifting Olympian was something like 15 years. Someone had a stat up recently, so it was one of the longer Olympians. A lot of Olympians start when they're about 8 and they finish their career in their late 20s. So you're looking at 20 years of weightlifting. And for a lot of you, you might have started later, but that doesn't mean you can't keep progressing. And 2 weeks over the course of 10 to 15 to 18 years is something that is so minute, and it'll benefit you so much at the start of the next training block if you just give it that time. So I know you love the gym, we love training as well, but just give it 2 weeks and you'll love it even more when you come back.
Now, if you want to make sure none of these things ever happen to you, the best thing you can possibly do is get on a weightlifting program that has some reactivity to it. So the Sika Strength app, we have a full weightlifting suite available to you. So you go on, you can try the programs, just create an account. You don't have to pay any money. There's a 7-day free trial. Once you get on the app, after each training session, you input the weights that you did. So obviously all your sets, reps, and load are prescribed. If any of those loads had to change a small bit, so say maybe today you're supposed to do 5 sets of 2 at 60 kilos on the snatch, you ended up doing 57.5 kilos, then that training logic, those algorithms that I was talking about, myself and Owen writing out for the last 2.5 years, will take care of what your loading looks like for the rest of the block. Now, you also have that defined factor of if you're able to extend the block, which is the ideal case, then you'll have a stepwise decrease and then that loading will slowly come back online. Or if you have a defined competition date, then that will push you back online a small bit faster. This is the most intelligent way possible to train. Also, it gives you access to weekly video feedback from myself and Owen via the members' live streams. Also, you can have a coach bot there with you during your sessions. This coach bot has basically been trained on the last 6 years of Sika Strength content. The questions we answer in your emails, the questions we answer in the live streams, the YouTube content, all of that has been fed into the coach bot. So if you have a quick question during your training session, maybe you're asking it about some deviation in bar path, maybe you ask it about your setup position, it'll be able to ping you back an answer very quickly that's come from myself and Owen in the years previous.